Welcome, ladies and gents. Chris Andre here. You can find me at BetBoxing on Twitter, or of course you can subscribe to the channel. Let's talk boxing. There's loads to cover today, so let's start off discussing SHAKUR Stevenson's career and what could potentially be next for him at lightweight. We may finally have some clarity. Before we get into that though, let's race through some of the history of what's been going on here with SHAKUR Stevenson, just to give you some background context. He initially was talking about fighting Vasyl Lomachenko or Devin Haney. He was even on a video call recently with Devin Haney and Bill Haney. That got a little bit heated, but of course those two are set to square off for the lightweight undisputed title. There was then talk about him fighting Ryan Garcia or potentially Tank Davis. Those two are also on a collision course, however, assuming Tank Davis comes through his next fight in the interim. That means that those four guys are out of bounds. So there was then talk of him targeting Isaac Cruz, the Pitbull. His people didn't seem to want to take the fight, and SHAKUR Stevenson began to mock him by referring to him as the Poodle. He then started to speak about wanting William Zepeda, and there was an approach made there, and although Zepeda himself said that he was interested in that sort of fight, it seems again that his people steered him in another direction. Much to the frustration of SHAKUR Stevenson, he said that he was then going to target George Kambosos. He's then since tweeted to say he's the third person to turn me down, and I haven't even fought one fight at 135 pounds. There's no Kambosos fight either. Shake my head. Let's see who's next. Now this rubbed up Kambosos the wrong way because there was the insinuation there of a duck. So George responded to say, I've done a hell of a lot at 135 pounds, especially in a year. I'm on well-deserved holidays with my kids, anticipating my return the middle of next year. No one can question a damn thing after the year I had and the blood I gave to boxing. Full respect, SHAKUR, and I feel an end of the year war coming in 2023. SHAKUR Stevenson responded in kind to say, respect, champ. I understand this. This is just the third time I get rejected and I haven't had one fight at 135 pounds. But it's understandable. You've been through a lot. Rest up, and when you're ready, I'll be here waiting. Kambosos then also responded one more time to say to him, looking forward to seeing you make your 135 pound debut, champ. Same problems I had when I was on the come up. I'm looking forward to being back middle of next year after my rest, and then would love to make a huge fight between us at the end of 2023. Hashtag respect. Now, I like the way that Kambosos has conducted himself here, and I like the way that SHAKUR Stevenson has conducted himself here. You know, when there's a lack of clarity, when guys like Pitbull or William Zepeda don't really give a reasonable explanation, fans can get frustrated. However, with Kambosos, I understand this, and I'm consistent when it comes to this. When Alexander Usyk said that he needed a rest before fighting Tyson Fury, a lot of people started to criticize him. I defended him. When Tyson Fury also said that he wanted a tune-up fight against a guy like Derek Chisora, although I did not like that specific fight because we've seen it on a couple of occasions before. As I've been saying on this channel, I had no problems with him fighting a guy of the level of Chisora that he's not fought before, say somebody like an Ajit Kabayel. In other words, I want the best to be at their best when they're fighting each other. I don't want to see a tired Alexander Usyk fight a rusty Tyson Fury. I want to see the sharpest Usyk fight the sharpest Fury. So if one of them needs a rest or the other one needs an interim tune-up fight, I've got no problem with that, as long as we then get to see the fight happen. Well, by the same token, if Kambosos feels like he needs a rest, I'm happy to see him take that rest. He's going to come back in the middle of next year. He's going to want a tune-up fight, and then he'll be looking for a big fight at the end of 2023. That makes sense to me. I get that. Despite that, though, you've had a very prominent boxing journalist make a very controversial comment. He sent a message to Tank Davis on Twitter to say Kambosos may be the weakest champ in history, and I can't find a close second. Again, this rubbed up Kambosos the wrong way. We know that he's a fiery character, and you know he'll pipe up with an emotional outburst here and there. And he said, you're the weakest reporter in history and the ugliest, and the next time I see you, I'm backhanding your Greek style. Best thing was seeing your ugly face full of disappointment at MSG when I bashed your boy Lopez. So what kind of champion was he? Now, listen. I know a lot of you out there are going to be thinking, George, man, calm down. Don't worry, he's not going to actually give Elie Seckbach one of these Greek-style backhands. It's not that going to happen. If he was there face-to-face, he may very well have reacted a little bit aggressively, but it's a Greek thing. Passions get the better of you sometimes, but by the time they come across each other, he'll calm down. The fact of the matter is, though, it's, for me, a real sign of disrespect when a supposed impartial reporter responds in this way for absolutely no reason. I mean, you're talking to a former lightweight, undisputed or unified, depending on where you stand, champion of the world. He's also had previous in this regard, Elie Seckbach, because he called Tyson Fury a trash boxer after Tyson Fury made a political statement that Elie Seckbach didn't like. Now, I can understand if you want to refer to somebody as a trash human being. Nobody is obliged to like another person, right? We've all got our individual morals, our own moral code and values, and some people fit into those and others don't. I get that. But when you're starting to question a guy's fighting ability for whatever reason because you don't like him, or because in this case with Kambosos, he beat your friend, you come across as rather silly. And there are ramifications for this too. Somebody said, don't listen to him, George. He's a certified waste man. And Kambosos responded to say, even lower than a waste man. Can't believe I gave this guy the time back in 2019 when he would snake around Team Pacquiao. Now I know why Freddie banned this flop from entering the gym. Even on media day, he wasn't allowed. Now, I don't agree ever with reporters not being given access. I don't agree with it. I think it's wrong. I think it opens a can of worms, a Pandora's box, whereby reporters have to play ball and they no longer become essentially journalists, they become cheerleaders in order to get access. So I don't agree with this. But by the same token, you have to conduct yourself with an ounce of decorum, with an ounce of professionalism. You have to conduct yourself like a journalist if you want to be treated like a journalist. Now, FightHype.com, another massive channel, also put out a bit of a suspect tweet. They said, man said the weakest, ... no lies told. Then they put a laughing face, popcorn, and then a Greek flag. Now, I'm confused by that, because why would they put popcorn and a Greek flag? That's almost like in support of Kambosos. But the tweet itself, the wording seems to be against him. So I wanted some clarification, and I said, what do you mean? Are you actually saying no lies were told, that Kambosos is the weakest champion ever? Please tell me that I've misinterpreted your tweet right now. Because again, not only is this unprofessional in the way it comes across, it's also wrong. It shows a lack of knowledge. Unless you've been watching boxing for the last 10 minutes, you're going to know there have been some champions that have been very weak. There have been some serious shocks in boxing. Kambosos is nowhere near the weakest champion there's ever been. But Kambosos responded to that. He saw the tweet, he responded, and he said, no, come on, Seckbach flop is the weakest. And I just said, listen, it's mad the disrespect you get. And it's a mindset that's a cancer in boxing. A champ takes on an elite level guy by taking a risk after already beating another elite level guy. And instead of being excited for his next fight, even though he lost, they still try to run him down, essentially. But other guys who are in the witness protection program, so to speak, they're put on a pedestal. We can't have this. This mindset is a cancer. And Kambosos said, it's just a select few that don't know anything about boxing. I've said it so many times that after I beat T.O., I had options of like 10 to 15 other guys for easy fights. I didn't want that. I chased the best and came up short, but the fans get upset when the big fights don't happen. It's a crazy sport. And he's right about this. Why should Crawford and Spence fight each other if the loser is thrown onto the scrap heap of history, so to speak? If the loser is looked down upon, instead of seeing them as two champions or one of them rose above the other and they're both on a pedestal, why would they take that risk? And I get it from biased tribal fans, but you do not expect this from established reporters like Elie Seckbach. I get it. Tiafimo's your mate. But at the end of the day, at this stage, you are a couple of pom-poms and a mini dress away from being a cheerleader. It's ridiculous. And listen, I'm not one of those guys who's got a problem with reporters developing personal relationships with fighters. I actually think it can be healthy to an extent. You see, a lot of people criticise the likes of Kugan Cassius for being close to Billy Joe Saunders, Eddie Hearn, Dillian Whyte. A lot of people were critical of IFL and Behind the Gloves when they took down interviews, for instance, of Mark Tibbs after the Billy Joe Saunders Canelo Alvarez fight. And I tried to explain to people at the time that I actually understood where they were coming from. They're professionals and they've developed relationships. They're not going to ruin their careers just to keep that particular interview up. And besides, something else that you have to understand is that when you have different types of journalists or journalistic approaches, you actually get a greater view from different angles as a viewer. In other words, if you have the likes of Kugan Cassius, who's willing to joke and become buddy-buddy with certain promoters and certain fighters, they're more likely to relax around Kugan. And so you get behind-the-scenes access, you get to see them have a sense of humour, talk normally. If everything was formal, there would be this barrier between the promoters and the fighters and the rest of the world. It would be like football interviews, soccer for American friends, whereby everything's very politically correct, have PR training to be able to speak to the media. You don't want that. You want a bit of both. You want an investigative journalist who's going to dig and pry and push, and then you also want a bit of fun too. So I've got no issue in that regard with Elie Seckbach being close to Teofimo Lopez, but you don't see Coogan or Michelle Joy Phelps or any of the other style of journalists who develop that buddy-buddy relationship who then start to call other opponents of their friends the worst champions or bums or this or that. It's ludicrous, man. Moving on from that though, and back to what it is that we were initially discussing, JoJo, my guy, we could get busy too, said Shakur Stevenson to JoJo Diaz, and JoJo Diaz responded to say, yes sir, all respect champ, let's make it happen. He copied in his promoter. This fight makes sense as a first step up for Shakur Stevenson. We know that JoJo Diaz is not massive, he's not a natural lightweight, but he's a very talented fighter. He's coming off of a loss to William Zepeda, so it wouldn't be a massive risk for Shakur Stevenson, but JoJo is a good enough, decorated enough fighter to make it interesting. So I like this as a first fight at lightweight anyway. Let me know what you think about this fight. Does it interest you at all? JoJo Diaz will also bring out a crowd, so it will generate interest as a fight as well. I really like it. Let's move on from that and try to get to the bottom of this forever evolving feud between Lawrence Okolie and Eddie Hearn and try to find out what the truth is, because I'm not privy to the inside aspects of this contract dispute, but I know what is publicly available. So let's try to nitpick through this and see if we can find the truth. But Lawrence Okolie gave an interview to Boxing King Media where he claimed that his contractual obligations had been met back in May. He was then in a negotiation with Matchroom to extend, but there was a gap between what the two sides were expecting, and so Okolie looked elsewhere. He found improved offers, went back to Matchroom, said, look, are you guys willing to get close to these numbers? If so, I'll extend. If not, I'll shake your hand and we all move on. At this point, Okolie accuses Eddie Hearn of looking for loopholes to say that actually your contract has not come to an end, and if you want out of the contract, you're going to have to buy yourself out essentially, which will cost you 500 grand. Now, Boxing King Media is one of those media companies whereby they like to not pull punches, and they will ask the tough questions. And he asked Eddie Hearn in a separate interview, look, in the past you've always said you would not stand in the way of a fighter who wants to leave. Why have things changed suddenly with Lawrence Okolie? And Eddie Hearn references a couple of different things. Firstly, he says we've lost an awful lot of money on Lawrence Okolie, and secondly, he also references the tweet that Lawrence Okolie put out there. For those of you that might not be privy to that tweet, it was a reference to Django, which is a movie about slavery, and he was essentially comparing Eddie Hearn to a slave driver. Eddie Hearn took that very personally. He obviously feels his name has been besmirched, and obviously it's got his backup. Now, in this particular interview, Lawrence Okolie concedes that he feels that he shouldn't have done that, he regrets doing that, and that he was not trying to actually bring any sort of racial accusation to the fore. He was basically talking about the fact that he felt he was enslaved, I guess you could say, within the contract, because he felt that his contract was over and they were looking for loopholes to keep him tied in. He also says that there were gagging orders, legally speaking, so that he couldn't speak publicly, while Eddie Hearn was spinning a narrative that was finding him guilty in the court of public opinion and he could not defend himself. So that's what Lawrence Okolie is saying in that regard. With regards to the idea of losing money on him, Lawrence Okolie says, look at it objectively. If someone's losing money on you, why not let him go? In this particular point, I disagree with Lawrence Okolie. Eddie Hearn, from his perspective, he's looking at this as a businessman. And when you are starting a business, what you are essentially doing is investing in an asset. And initially, you are losing money. As you invest in a shop, you're going to invest to decorate it, you're going to invest to buy the stock that you're going to sell. All this requires capital that you're going to spend. So you would go into the minus. From there, you start to recoup that money. And then from there, you start to make a profit. So for what Eddie Hearn's essentially saying here, and I'm not saying he's right or wrong morally, whatever. We're just talking about his perspective from a business side of things. I've spent a lot of money on Lawrence to build him up. He wasn't exciting. A lot of people were calling him boring. We've turned him into a world champion. We've lost money on him. Now we're in a position to potentially make him profitable, and he wants to leave. I'm not willing to let him go to a rival promoter and a rival network now that he's already made asset to go and become the face of Sky Boxing when we built him up, unless we recoup some of the money that we have invested in this guy. I understand that logic. However, there is a flip side to that. And the flip side is, you should have thought of that when you initially came up with the initial length of the contract. Your job is to make a profit within the realm of the length of the contract. If you need longer, well, then you need to extend the contract. Now, in fairness to Eddie Hearn, you did have the COVID measures, and they could not get him to fight Glavatsky in that period of time. So instead, what Eddie Hearn claims is that they offered him an alternative fight to Glavatsky, which would exist as a parallel to the world title fights that he had agreed in his contract. So it would not replace the fights that Okolie was obligated to fight that were big title fights, but it would exist as an addition. And this was in a time when a lot of fighters were begging for fights during the period of the COVID measures, and, you know, boxing obviously slowed down a little bit. From a legal perspective, it seems to me that Eddie Hearn is in the right here, because Okolie claims that he's not been consulted, he's let go of 258 management, he doesn't feel like he had legal representation at the time, and so he's obviously not happy with his management team. But from what we know, I'm only judging this based on the evidence that I can see, I could very well be wrong, but from what we seem to be hearing here, he looked at the terms of that fight and he was consulted. He did accept the fight, he looked at the terms, he signed for the fight. So what Eddie Hearn is saying here is you had legal representation in the form of your management team. If you and your management team don't see eye to eye, that's not Matchroom's problem. Now, from a moral perspective, if he was not consulted by his management team, of course he's going to be upset. But from a legal perspective, it seems that everything that was done by Matchroom in that regard seems to be above board. But now they've got their back up. They don't want to strengthen the position of Sky or Boxer. They've said that Sky and Boxer knew he was under contract and tried to turn his head with an unrealistic high offer, or an offer that simply Eddie Hearn is not willing to meet. This is what he told in an interview with IFL. And so as a result, he's now standing firm and he's being stubborn about it. But from a legal perspective, you can't really see, from what we've seen as information, from what we know as information, how Lawrence Okolie wins that argument. But Lawrence does make some very good points on the moral aspect. And I don't mean morally Matchroom need to let him go. If this is an agreement that these two have made, if he was consulted, or if his management team were representing him and they knew and they signed on his behalf, you can't blame Matchroom. I'm talking more along the lines of those that are saying that even if Lawrence Okolie chooses to leave after the contract legitimately comes to an end, that he's somehow immoral or somehow disloyal. Firstly, a lot of people are criticizing Lawrence, saying, hold on a second, what about the Rolex? He got you a Rolex, you should be grateful. And Lawrence goes on to explain, listen, I was amateur turning pro and I was told if I achieve certain objectives, I'll get the gift of a Rolex. And I achieved those objectives. I was eternally grateful. I praised Eddie Hearn. I thanked Eddie Hearn. But just because you got me a Rolex doesn't mean that I have to fight for you for less money than I would get elsewhere in the future. You are offered a certain amount to do a job. If somebody offers you more money to do that same job, you'd be stupid not to take that. You have no moral obligation. That watch is not a down payment. It's a gift. So I understand Lawrence Okolie in that regard. The other area that I think he makes a really good point is when he actually points to Eddie Hearn's track record in this regard. You've got two organizations. One of them helped build me up. Well, Sky helped build up Eddie Hearn and Matchroom too. I worked hard for them, they worked hard for me, we were loyal, we achieved good things together. Same with Sky and Eddie Hearn. Then another organisation comes along and says, we're going to offer you a lot more money now that your contract's coming to an end to come to us, just like DAZN did. Eddie Hearn took the offer from DAZN. So why would anybody expect Lawrence Okolie to do something different? Is it one rule for me and one rule for you? Now, Jerome, shout out to Jerome, he said on Twitter he sees this as a false equivalence. I personally don't. I completely see what Lawrence Okolie is saying in this regard. But because Lawrence Okolie has sort of retracted, or at least tried to soften what he meant regarding that Django tweet, and another comment he made in an interview to IFL is making me think that he softened his position to try and not burn bridges, to try and consider damage limitation in this regard. Because in an interview with IFL, he also turned around and said that he would be willing to work with Eddie Hearn again in the future when Kugan Cassius asked him that. And you can see he wants to get certain stuff off his chest, because he also says that what really shook him up is when his own mum said to him, what's going on, Lawrence? You've got one fight left on your contract with Eddie. What are you doing? And he was saying, wow, I couldn't believe that Eddie was so good at spinning stuff that I had to then sit my mum down and say to her, mum, that's not what's happened. These are the realities, to try and win her over. And that's when he realized how good Eddie Hearn was at selling a story. So it's moments like that where you can see that to me anyway, it looks like he wants to get things off his chest. He's upset at Eddie. Eddie's more overtly upset. You can clearly see that. But by the same token, he's trying to bring about a bit of softening to the situation and considering his future. He's trying to see this as more of a business transaction. Eddie Hearn is also seeing it from a business transaction, but he's taking things a little bit more personally based on that besmirching tweet. Let me know what you think about this whole situation. Who do you believe? Whose side are you on? Let me know how you interpret all of this. Thanks for watching, everyone. Please don't forget to hit a stiff jab on the like button, a right cross on the subscribe button, and an uppercut on the notifications button. Thanks for watching, everyone. Chat to you soon. Take care. God bless.